Welcome back to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Matthew Moyen. In this episode, Lingua Franca. Although English is for many the overwhelming language of choice for modern webcomics, it is by no means a requirement. In the modern environment of global communications, digital comics in French, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, and many other languages are becoming increasingly important as the medium's influence expands. But language still represents a barrier in many parts of the world as well. So how does one go about translating and interpreting a comic between one or more languages? First, Christina Major of the comic Sombulus has an interview with Enistoja, Spanish language translator for the comics Cucumber Quest and RetroBlade, about coping with nuances of language and the importance of using a skilled translator. Then, Ewa of the comic Bits Fair will be back for a discussion with our members Sophie Pfrötzschner of the comic Soul's Journey, Mikael Hankonen of the comic Tistow Small Trolls, and Joolita of the comic of Conquests and Consequences about choosing English for their comics and the challenges that come with creating comics in a foreign language. Clear communication is the subject for this episode, so stay with us.
I'm Christina Major of the webcomic Sombulus. I'm here today with Eni, who is a great translator working on the Spanish language translations of some really cool webcomics and other fiction projects. Thank you so much for joining me, Eni.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so you translate webcomics, right?
2 webcomics, and I've offered services to others. Technically, I am not a professional since I don't have the required studies, but I am getting them. I am fluent in English and Spanish and speaking them all my life. But there is a difference between being fluent and being a translator, so.
How did you get into this? What were your first experiences like translating webcomics, and how did you get involved in the projects you're translating now?
When I was a child, I used to see movies with my parents, and they used to have sometimes good, sometimes terrible subtitles, and I kind of resented that people with less English knowledge than me were getting high-profile jobs, like getting subtitles for Disney. So I decided that I wanted to do something to make everything more accessible for people. And I started reading webcomics, and I decided, hey, I would like this to reach more people, and for instance, for Cucumber Quest, which I haven't translated in a while, because of university, but I'm working on it, I contacted Gigi Digi, the author, and she gave me permission to do it as a fan translation. That's how it started in that case.
So you were the one who was reaching out to the webcomics that you knew and loved to try to get them to reach a wider audience?
Mm-hmm.
How long have you been at it? Has it changed at all since you started?
Not really. Actually, let me just check. Because I honestly don't remember when I started with Cucumber Quest. That was on 2014.
Oh, wow.
And, well, I'm also doing a RetroBlade for Freya.
Yeah, she's a member of ours.
Yeah, I've been doing that for way less time, but I mentioned that I could translate it for her if she wanted, and she said sure, and we've been working together for a bit since.
Oh, that's cool. So what does the process of translating a comic look like for you? Do you get a script from the comic creator, or you just take whatever art or pages are up there and kind of work with that? How does that look?
Well, for instance, with Cucumber Quest, since it's an entirely fan-made thing that I'm not getting any payment for, and honestly I don't particularly care, it's something that I love, I just get what's on the page. I just get it translated and then edit the page myself, which can sometimes be a bit difficult considering that she makes some beautiful pages that don't have text bubbles, so I just have to get really intense with the Photoshop.
Oh, wow.
In the case of RetroBlade, on the other hand, I just give Freya the translated script, since she has some really special fonts that she's using on her own. And other webcomics, the ideal would be to get the script for current and future things, so that a future reveal or something that relies on obfuscating information via text, it can be done in the Spanish language as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that to consider, just the linguistic differences and the nuances that are going to go into a Spanish translation. Have there been any big challenges that you've faced when trying to make English phrases or dialects or concepts in a comic work in Spanish?
Well, it's not necessarily comics related, but I also translate micro SFF on Twitter, which is short sci-fi or fantasy stories in a single tweet, and that is challenging. But as far as comics go, there's lettering, of course, which is very difficult, particularly with the Cucumber Quest, where I'm editing it myself. I only have the space that I'm provided, and, well, I'm learning a lot about lettering just by using someone else's work. And there's also the fact of wordplay and puns. The puns are very fun to translate, but very frustrating when I can't get them right.
Yeah. The whole humor aspect is, I don't even know how I would start. Or, like, do you just try to translate it literally, or do you try to come up with something similar in concept? I don't even know.
Well, if it translates literally, which is rarely, and it makes sense and it's funny, I keep that and I am relieved. But when it doesn't, I try to follow the approach that the translators for the Asterix and Obelix comics did. Try to keep the number of jokes per page the same.
Okay, that's an interesting approach. So you preserve the tone of it, even if you don't necessarily use the exact same jokes in the exact same beats?
Mm-hmm. And I just hope that whatever joke I'm making doesn't contradict any canon.
That's true. Especially if these are fan projects, then to your point, if you don't have advanced knowledge of the script and what they are hinting at, you don't want to say something that's not true.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned that ideally I get the script, or if I don't, I keep contact with the author, because, well, that makes everything easier, just for small things like if a person talks with a polite tone or with a more casual tone, or bigger things like trying to make sure that a translation that doesn't quite translate one-to-one doesn't accidentally mess up something in the future, which has happened in Cucumber Quest, and I've been honestly dreading to go back and editing everything, but since I'm moving everything from Blogspot to a site that explicitly does webcomics in Spanish, I am going to have to go back and edit some.
Is it something that readers have noticed in that case, or is it just something that you know now that you need to change?
It's something that I know now. It's mostly about the character's name pronunciation being different from what the text would imply. And, well, that doesn't translate in Spanish, where all letters almost always sound the same. So now I have to include that joke from the very beginning.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's just so interesting because in my experience growing up in America, we often only study languages other than English in school for just a couple of years. Definitely not as much as the rest of the world, I understand, and it's been really tempting to me to use that very rudimentary knowledge to make my own translation of my comic or hack together something with Google Translate. You know, I was very influenced by manga growing up, so I had this idea, I'm going to translate my stuff into Japanese to reach a different audience because then it'll be more authentic to manga. But does that ever work, or is there something more that a professional translator or a native speaker will bring to the process?
Google Translate. I mean, it works in a pinch, but mostly in the sense that I have to talk to this person right now, and I'm going to give them a very broken version of their language to at least get some communication across. But for bigger pieces of text, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, a translator and a native speaker, they will both understand sentence structure, phrase fluidity, puns. Everything is going to be better than just throwing it into Google Translate, which is just going to give you a literal translation that will almost never be something that a native speaker is going to see and say, yeah, that looks like something natural.
Yeah, to be able to reach other audiences, it has to be an experience for them where they're not getting distracted by the words you're saying so much that they can't look at the story you're writing.
Yeah, absolutely. It also adds to the whole issue, the fact that there are different dialects of the same language. Like, I make my Spanish translations as neutral as possible, but I just know that someone from Chile or someone from Spain is going to say, that is definitely not from here. And, well, there's not much that I can do about that. But if you try to claim that your translation is going to be for everyone, it's not going to be.
And that's interesting that you bring that up, because we don't often consider that, at least in America, that there are a lot of different dialects, and Spanish in one place is extremely different than Spanish in another place. And there's just going to be different ways of speaking and reaching those audiences. So being really conscientious about who your audience is important too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very. For instance, I started following some Spain translators. This very proficient translator, Ramon Mendez, he translates games, and he has shared some stuff in Spanish. And sometimes I understand it, but when it gets to more technical language, I just plain don't. It made me painfully aware of just how different Mexican Spanish is versus Spain Spanish.
Yeah, there's so much going on. Spanish in particular is just such a diverse language in so many countries. Always important to think about. So are there any other projects that you could tell us that you're working on now? You mentioned the sci-fi fantasy microfiction Twitter, which I've seen a couple times, and that looks awesome.
Yes, the writer he's got a great sense of humor, and he's very prolific too, and fantastic mind. I may in the future translate a fan game called Boktai 3D, which is a fan sequel to a couple of DS and Game Boy Advance games. But other than that, there's just Cucumber Quest, which I have stopped doing because it was a lot of intense work that I can't quite keep up with university. But since I'm starting to get a handle on university, I might start trying to get back on it again. And there's RetroBlade, of course. We haven't actually published anything yet, but we are working on getting everything up on this website called Subcultura, which is a collection of webcomics in Spanish. So that's going to be there in the future.
Great. Anything else you want to say? Any advice for people looking to either get into translating comics or who have comics of their own that they want to get translated and they don't know how to go about getting them?
If you want to get into translating, well, in my case, I'm just in a very privileged position of having English and Spanish as basically both being my mother languages because I've been speaking them since I was like 3. But for people who are just studying the language versus being born into it, I would recommend that there are studies in most universities that focus on the process of translating versus just speaking the language. And that's what I'm taking right now. I'm studying Spanish as translation since I'm in Canada. It's I can only approach it through that aspect. As for getting your own translation done, there are many translators on Twitter. Like I mentioned, Ramon Mendez, he's connected with the translator community. He's super prolific and a super nice guy. He might be able to hook you up with someone who might be able to help you. I am more than willing to offer my services as well, though, like I said, technically I am not a professional, so I will do my best. I take a lot of pride in my work. If anyone wants any webcomics or comics or whatever translated, I'm always happy to help.
Hey everyone, I'm Eva and I'm here together with 3 members of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective to talk about making webcomics in English as non-native English speakers. With me, the Sophie Pfrötzschner, the creator of Soul's Journey.
Hello there.
Mikael Hankonen, the co-creator of Tistow, Small Trolls, and the creator of Year in Hereafter.
Hello.
And Joolita, the co-creator of Conquests and Consequences.
Hello.
So my first question to you all is, did you make comics in your native language first and then make the switch to English later, or started translating them to English later? Or have you been making comics in English from the start? Because I got into comics by reading English language translations of manga, so I just started making them in English from the beginning.
I've been thinking about Soul's Journey in English only, basically. It's only been lately that I've been thinking about translating it into German and actually doing that with the first 2 chapters already. I don't know, when I think about a comic in English, it's always how it's supposed to be. And then when I think about it in German, it's just so awkward and weird. Like, it's not my comic at all.
It's basically the same thing for me in Finnish. It just does not work at all when you're trying to make comics or anything. It's a weird language. But yeah, it's been English for me too, all the time, from script, from everything. It just works better that way. I'm not really sure what it is about Finnish language, but it somehow doesn't work. It's somehow really old-fashioned language. It doesn't really work with modern art at all, even with Finnish movies and series. It just doesn't sound good. It's weird to say, but it just doesn't. So it never occurred to me to think that maybe I should do this comic in Finnish. That's all.
I must say more or less the same as my esteemed predecessors, because Monen and I, when we started scripting the comic, some of these dialogues that the scenes we started to put together, some of them were in Polish, some of them were in English, and then there came the decision about what language does the final product going to be in, and we at a very early stage decided that this is going to be English. It doesn't have to do with the nature of the Polish language, whether it's suitable for comics or not. It's just about the nature of the market. We switched to English and to scripting the comic in English very early on. So from the first sort of pages and all this sort of conceptual work, most of it was done in English. So you can say that the English is the original version of Conquests and not the Polish one, although it was a conscious decision and not something that sort of emerged naturally, so to speak.
I see. What do you mean by the nature of the market? Just the size of the potential audience, or...?
Yes and yes. Basically, to my knowledge at least, there aren't any platforms like Smackdrift or the Spiderforest Collective. There aren't any associations or free sites to put your comic on that could bring you to your audience very directly. I think some of Polish webcomics are published in the English language, sites like Smackdrift or the Manga Reader, but there is no Polish interface. So to access those, a user must know English. Why limit yourself to the Polish users only when you can just access these sites with an English language translation, given that every user who is basically looking for content on these sites will have to know English anyway. So that's one thing. And the other thing is even printed comics or webcomics in Polish, they're a bit different than what we were trying to make with Conquests, yes? So most of them were basically comic strips based on some sort of episodic humor or very short content, not really narrative in nature. So we didn't feel that we are providing something that people would actually want to read or were used to reading. So we weren't sure if we actually find any audience if we started out in Polish and just continued in that language.
Mikael and Sophie, have audience size considerations been there for you?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've been on a German anime and manga site before, and they had a feature where you could actually submit a comic, or in their case a doujinshi, and you could update it page by page whenever you've got another one ready. I mean, it was a neat feature, and I totally missed that when I moved to DeviantArt a little later. Then when I discovered webcomics, most of them were in English. I never actually saw one in German, unless they were translated in order to, get more people in, like Dreamland Chronicles, for example. But even then, the translations kind of stopped halfway through, so the English language was pretty dominant, and that also formed my decision, yes.
I remember you saying one time that the German comics at German comic conventions tend to be very manga-like, and that's why you were doing it all in English.
Yes, that's true. Whenever I'm at a convention for either books or something that's actually called a comic convention, you have 90% manga and anime in those halls, and a lot of cosplayers who really focus on anime and manga. I don't think I've ever seen anything from US comics or something. Although there were a few characters from Homestuck running around last time I was at a convention.
That sounds so much the same that what it is in Finland, actually. It's just, when you talk about comics, surprisingly few people think about Marvel comics. For one, it's always anime and manga, so it also gets a stigma there, which is why the comics are not all that popular in Finland at all. And it just doesn't, make sense to try to make anything in Finnish, because it most likely will get swiped under this kind of stigma of anime and manga, and then it's not really cared about. They don't see the other ways of making comics at all.
But in Lenov, it's a bit different in Poland, because, of course, there's this huge part of the market that's anime and manga, and there are even some local publishing houses specializing in publishing Polish language mangas, basically. But there are comic conventions, and there are whole communities or markets for Western-style Polish comics. But again, they are very different than what we're offering. They're mostly one-shots, and they focus on, well, let's say a different demographic that what we're trying to reach. Some of them are what you would call very artsy, so the style is, well, very stylized, very purposefully made to look at a certain standard, one would call perhaps hipster. So, again, not something that we would, with our comic, sort of belong to.
I think we are surprisingly hipster. I think we are all really, really hipster. We do our own thing, make it look its own thing.
Yeah, we are the true hipsters.
Yeah, another thing I noticed, I've been looking around the German webcomic scene a lot a few months ago, since I started translating Source Journey into German. And, I found that site where they basically collect German webcomics and link to them. Kind of like the sites you see around on Twitter all the time. I browsed through them, and I think all of them were Gag-A-Day comics. And I'm kind of an outlier in that. I don't really like making Gag-A-Day comics, and I don't think I ever will. So yeah, that's really hard to go with the flow in this case.
Another thing that I'd like to discuss is the issues stemming from writing in a language that is not your native. Because even if you are quite fluent, you're still going to make the occasional mistake. I know that I'll never really wrap my head how the English tenses work. The stuff like have been doing and would have had known. That's not how my native language works, and that stuff drives me insane. So, do you worry about making mistakes? Do you hire somebody to proofread your comics? Or do you not worry at all? Just what do you do about that?
I'm surprisingly lax when it comes down to it, because, not to toot my own horn, but Finnish language in itself it really teaches you a lot of different kinds of ways to say things. It's really complex. So when introduced to a language like English and Japanese and German even, it's surprisingly easy to learn that kind of stuff. But what I've noticed from myself is the words like onto, into, unto, those kind of little words in the middle do give me trouble, because I can't really see the logic in them. Like, if I was to say punch in the face, or is it punch on the face? How does that work? That kind of thing does get me confused, but otherwise I'm really lax about it, and I don't really worry. And I don't really even proofread stuff all that much before I put the pages online, because I'm quite confident that if there is a mistake, somebody will point it out anyway, and I can then fix it. But before book print releases or anything like that, then I do make the effort to pay somebody who is a native English speaker to check, just in case. But otherwise, I'm not really all that worried about it.
Yeah, I have some words like everywhere, anywhere, these kind of words that depend on circumstance and context. We don't have that kind in German. In this case, it would be just überall, and, it's just one word, and you don't have to think about, does it have to be everywhere or anywhere? And yeah, that's what's giving me a lot of trouble. Also, the German language is constructed a little differently from English, and my sentence constructions are a little odd at times when I write in English, but, that's what you got beta readers for.
I have the comfort of having a co-author who is also a linguist, so
that is nice. That is nice.
It is awfully convenient, I must say. So when we arrive at a dialogue, sometimes we would argue about how to put it to make it sound more naturally. But of course, mistakes will happen, like typos, and sometimes we get confused in our linguistic inclinations and get the tenses too confusing for readers to follow. But, well, basically feedback is for that. As Mikael said, if there's some problem, then the readers will point it out. And I don't think we should be afraid of making mistakes because, well, natives, they make them too, a lot.
Yeah,
Experience. So it's not like they will, I don't know, begrudge us for being inaccurate sometimes. And the feedback so far has been very positive, so I don't think it's anything stressful at all.
Yeah, I think for those that don't have English as a native language, we tend to overanalyze our own writing when some English speakers just, write the stuff and then perhaps they've got a typo in there or they make it their mistake, I guess we are more afraid of that since we don't use English the way they do.
Yeah, it would be so embarrassing, but then again, it's really not that bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the end of the world, usually.
So, beyond the grammar issues, I've always felt an emotional disconnect from the English language because it's not the language of my daily life, and I have never lived in an English-speaking country. So, English words are just simply words. They have no emotional meaning for me, and swear words too are just normal words, and I don't have any strong memories attached to them or anything. And I think the way I make my characters talk, I wouldn't necessarily make them talk that way if they were talking in my native language, or even the stuff that I write in my scripts. I wouldn't necessarily even write the same sorts of stories if I were writing in my native language, in the language where all the words have some sort of emotional meaning for me and all sorts of memories attached to them. So, I don't know, is it just me or is this common to other people too?
Well, I suppose in a sense, I used to be really, just really proper about the English language at first, before I actually started to realize that there are some casual ways that you can describe different kind of feelings and emotions and all of that, like you said. But then when Ellie came along 2 years ago, I started to pay a lot more attention because she is a lot more experienced with that sort of stuff. And with us changing some characters and having cameos and her basically directing me in what her cameo in my comic would say, that has really helped me to kind of distinguish that there are differences in that kind of emotionally charged things, so to say. It's funny how I didn't realize how stiff some characters can sound and how you can make a purpose out of it instead of it just being the fact that you are not so familiar with the language and you are writing it this way just to make sure that it's proper English. But I wouldn't have noticed it if somebody would have pointed it out to me and basically directed me to think about it.
I've noticed that. I've been making Soul's Journey for about 3 years now. And whenever I go over the first chapter again, I notice things that I could improve in the way characters are talking. And I've done it a few times already. I've kept all the versions before, and sometimes I just like to compare them and like to see how I've also grown in terms of letting characters talk and letting the characters be themselves and not me trying to convey their thoughts.
For us, I think the emotional thing is exactly the opposite from what Eva said, because there's so much content in English that you consume every day, and basically you hear talk about emotions and characters expressing their emotions, and you see that in webcomics that you read, and you hear that in the series that you watch. So basically, I think at that point, it's more natural for us to fashion a dialogue in English that would be emotional or convey a specific message than to do the same in our native Polish, because, well, basically, the content in Polish that we consume daily is, I think, of a different nature. I mostly read academic texts or, everyday sort of texts, and I don't think I would be even able to express as much emotion as I am able to sort of pour into our characters in English, precisely because certain words have certain emotional depth to them. Thinking about them in Polish makes me sort of awkward, Whereas in English, this emotional detachment, I think, helps me to be a better author because I don't feel this second-hand embarrassment when making
absolutely.
dialogue.
Definitely, yeah. I noticed that too. Whenever I get emotional, my thoughts turn to English, and then it's just, they're pouring down. Whereas
that is weird.
I couldn't even articulate it in German.
I thought I was the only one who does that.
Sophie, you've been translating your comic into German. So you have said that all the issues having to do with German comics on the internet and what sort of audience you would find or would not find. So why did you decide to translate it?
Well, for one, I said that I came from this German anime and manga website, and I've had a few people there ask me if this project is actually still a thing, although I linked to it a long time ago and told them that, yeah, that's where the webcomic updates and it's gonna be in English. Those people still want it in German, actually, so that's what got it rolling. I just put it off a long time, because whenever I think for the characters in German, it's just like they got these bad voice actors that I sometimes see on television, and it's just so weird. So yeah, I've been putting it off for a long time, and then when I finally decided to go with it, I've also been doing a bit more research into the whole German comic scene, which just discouraged me a lot. I mean, there are a few things out there, and maybe we need a few fresh things on the German comic scene.
Yeah, I have also thought about it in the sense that, well, there aren't really all that many comics in my native language, especially since my native language is a non-standard dialect of a language, so there are, like, I don't know, 100,000 people total who can speak it on this planet, so what's the point of translating it anyway? But
this could be your true 100,000 fans.
But, you know, sometimes I think about it in the sense that, well, there isn't all that much stuff, so I have the duty to translate this stuff into my native language and be that person making this content in this language, of course.
I have to comment on that a little bit because, after all, my own comic derives from the Finnish national epic. So it always seems a little bit mean of me to basically make a story out of it, but not make it in Finnish, because after all I should be entirely respectful to the Finnish heritage and the folklore that goes behind it. But seriously, it's just not worth the effort at the end of it. Finnish people just don't read comics in Finnish because they basically have the same mindset as me. And it is that whatever is in Finnish, it's going to sound awkward. It's not going to be fun to read and that sort of thing. But as long as I can make some kind of good honor to our national epic Kalevala, that would be really nice. And if I can at least do that, then I'm completely happy.
Well, we started translating into Polish mainly because some friends asked us to. It was very kind of to cater to personal preferences. At that time, the comic was also up on DeviantArt. So we had like maybe not a lot of following, but like a steady following there. And I was looking for some feedback because when we put it up on SmackTreeves, it was basically one of the very, very many. So it was very difficult to get any comments, positive or otherwise. So in order to kind of make it more accessible perhaps, or like to feed my ego a little bit, I put it up on DeviantArt, and immediately there was this response from my friends like, why don't you make it in Polish? I mean, the English, it's so tedious to read in English. So yeah, we decided to make a Polish language version as well, so that our friends wouldn't pester us anymore.
Oh, that's really kind of you.
Well, you know, it pays off sometimes, and sometimes it's a chore, but, you know, it's a labor of love anyway, with any kind of comic, so translating it into a language is just a part of it.
I once interviewed a Russian webcomics artist who also translates her comic just mainly for her friends and family, so, yeah. But I would never do it, though.
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, I'm basically the only person in my family that kind of speaks English. I mean, my mom is trying, since she is always reading English books by Jasper Ford, because she can't wait for the German translation. And then there's my little brother, now 12, who is just starting out to learn, and he's really eager to learn, so he can kind of keep up with me. But all the other people aren't really good at English, and that's why having something in German makes it easier to tell them that, yes, I'm working on something, and yes, you can also read it.
Well, it's very nice that your family is interested, and, that you can sort of have some feedback and support from them, even if it means translating your comic into German. With my family, I think it works the other way around. Like, the English part of the comic works as a shield somewhat, so that when they ask me what the comic is about and, like, why am I spending so much time doing it, I can say, well, it's very nice and it's very interesting, but unfortunately it's in English, so, and the translation is like 2 chapters behind, so poor you can't be up to date. So, when I get into some risk topics later, perhaps in the plot, I can just clearly edit it out of the Polish translation. No one will know.
Sneaky.
So, okay, I have asked all the questions I had, so to wrap this up, is there anything that hasn't been mentioned yet that you would like to mention?
Well, there's the challenges of translating. There's this content thing that, some words sound longer and, like, some stuff can sound more awkward. I guess it's probably true of German and Finnish, and it's definitely true of Polish. It's longer than English.
Oh, yes. We've got these puzzle words that you can just stick together. One person just called it the Lego of languages. And, we've got these super long and awkward words, and try putting them into a word balloon. It just looks so weird, and, it's really not space conforming.
We have one Patreon who is from Austria, and I do believe that in Austria, German is the language, isn't it?
Yes, they do. They speak.
Yeah. Their address has the longest word I have ever seen, and I have written it out on an envelope so many times, but still I'm worried about it because it just jumps in my eyes and it's hard to copy and write out. It's such a long word. That is insane.
Yeah, as I said, it's a long, complicated language, and we like to puzzle things together.
Well, yeah, it doesn't really lend itself well to speech bubbles, does it?
The thing is, when you say word construction in English, like House of Cards, for example, we just say Kartenhaus, and that's one word and not 3 words that you can just split wherever.
Yeah, so sometimes the target dialogue will end up completely different than the original, mostly because you have to fit it in a bubble, or if you're making a new bubble, then, it can't be that large. So sometimes you kind of cut content or you shuffle content sometimes to make this comic look more or less decent.
I've had one part where I kind of had to change the meaning of the dialogue so it would still fit into that corner of the panel. I tried to keep the meaning as close to the original as possible, but it just couldn't fit. So I tried my best to stay in line, but German language is just too long, too many letters.
I don't think we actually changed the meaning at any point. However, there are some phrases that, especially with style, English has this sort of nice, clean, general style that unless you want to stylize much, make a character speak in a dialect or purposefully maybe change the word order or something, it doesn't really very easily say the mood of the sentence or something. With languages that have inflection, like Polish, some words can be shuffled. And I think some pages of Conquests, they have this kind of very chatty style that the English ones perhaps don't really have. I don't know. Maybe it's easier for me to detect it in Polish because I know the connotations of a given dialogue. But the English ones are cleaner. The Polish ones, sometimes they have this chatty style, and on the other hand, sometimes when we're tired and, the translation just looks awkward and I'm looking at it and I think, God, it doesn't sound natural at all. But with some of them, it's very neat.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer for this program was Christina Major, and Eva was our director, our showrunner, and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support. To learn more about the collective, our members, and our projects, or to make a donation, go to spiderforest.com. I'd like to thank Enistoja for joining us for this episode, and you can read the comic Cucumber Quest at cucumber.ggdg, that's gigidigi.com. And you can also read the comic RetroBlade at retrobladecomic.com. Thanks also to Christina for bringing us that interview. You can read her comic Sombulus at sombulus.com. I'd also like to thank Eva for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as our members who participated, Sophie Pfrötzschner, Mikael Hankonen, and Joolita. Sophie produces the comic Soul's Journey. You can read it at soulsjourney.garitianchronicles.com. Michael co-creates the comic Tistow, Small Trolls with Eli Pukangas. You can read it at smalltrolls.tistow.uk. Joolita produces the comic of Conquests and Consequences. You can read it at ocac.spiderforest.com. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Matthew Moyen. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
And Eva mentioned swear words, yeah? Some characters, when they swear, they don't sound as terrible in English as they would in our native languages.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of find the swear words in English, they're so soft. When I compare them to their German counterparts, I mean, I'd hide under a blanket if they were swearing in German, but in English it's just so soft and repetitive.
How do you translate it then, if you need a swear word? Like, do you soften it? Or do you just kind of go full blow?
I think I'd go all out. But I'm not really much on swearing in Soul's Journey, so...
I don't know, English swearing can be so mean and it can be so purposefully angry and everything. But when you swear in Finnish, it's more about the guts that you have, the guts to beat the situation and the inner strength, instead of being nasty. It's an interesting little contrast about that.
Funnily enough, we had this kind of meta problem with swearing in Conquests because, like, there are characters from two different cultures and we had to decide at one point whether to use the same type of swear words. So for one culture, we basically decided to go with this kind of sexual-based swear words, like the ones that English uses. And with the other, we started sort of thinking and in the end decided to go like with disease-based swear words. So obviously the one that's sexually based sounds worse or looks worse in English than the other ones, the ones that's sort of not invented per se, because all of these swear words that we're using for the disease-based swear words are actually like, or were used as swear words at one point or another in English. But they look very mild in comparison with all these sort of juicy F words that we did use once or twice, I suppose. So even within the comic, it's funny. And when you translate it into Polish, funnily enough, it's the other way around, because Polish has many swear words that are disease-based. And whereas some of them are pretty mild, some of them are like kind of moderate plus, I would say. And like the sexual ones are kind of, well, not maybe verb-based, not like the things that you do, but like adjectives and stuff. And the odd noun here and there. So it was more natural to use these disease-based ones in the Polish translation than the sex-based ones. It was a weird problem. So like in one language it looks worse in the one version, in the other it kind of looks worse with the other. So like the shift changes, which is I think quite interesting.